So I am very, very pleased to introduce David Straub, retired senior foreign officer for the U.S. Department of State, and also former assistant director at Stanford University, who has very generously taken time out to give us his remarks and also such insight into really in-depth experience in working with North Korean-American relations. And because, you know, North Korea is not just a country that is off there that we had a war at, but it persists to be, I think, as we've discussed in the morning, a topic of constant interest and constant importance to not only our, you know, Far East friends over there, but to actually our domestic situation. So thank you so much, David, and without further ado, welcome, David.
Thank you, Dohee, and thank you to the NAM Center, and thanks especially to our teacher participants here today. It's a privilege for me to be with you. I have the deepest respect for the work that you do. What you do is key to our country and our democracy. I was asked to prepare about a 50-minute lecture, and I did my job. I prepared, I don't know how many, about 20-page single-spaced pages, and you will get a copy of that prepared text in your materials. I'm going to be speaking mostly about the United States relationship with North Korea and U.S. policy toward North Korea. I did not coordinate intentionally with Professor Lee, so there is a little overlap between what I prepared and what he has presented already. He did a brilliant job of that, and so I'll do my best to minimize any overlap. Because we don't have a lot of time, because this is the afternoon nap period, because it's the last presentation of the day, and because I've been delighted to realize how much most, if not all, of our participants today already know about Korea, I propose not to use, if possible, the entire 50 minutes in lecture, but to shorten that and to leave a lot more time for discussion, if that is okay. And since you will be getting the prepared text, I'd be delighted if, when you go home, if you can take 10 minutes to glance at it, because I tried to write it in a straightforward fashion, but the conclusions I put in there are very much my own personal conclusions. A lot of experts on Korea or North Korea policy will not necessarily agree with what I wrote, but it is the result, or at least what I believe at this point in my life, after about almost 4 decades of studying North Korea. So I hope it's at least thought-provoking for you. So I will focus in my remarks on U.S. Policy toward North Korea. I do not claim to be an expert on North Korea. You may see in the media lots of people talking about themselves being expert on North Korea. It's very hard to be an expert on North Korea, at least in terms of the kinds of issues that I'm going to talk with you about today, the nuclear issue and issues of how North Korea is governed, because North Korea is very secretive and doesn't allow us to have insight or direct access to the upper reaches of their government where these issues are decided. Another remark I would make in preface is that you will find in the media especially, but also in academic writings, a lot of different interpretations of what I call the North Korea problem. And I would like to give you a few reasons for that so that you won't be surprised when you see those different interpretations, and so that you'll have a sense of why those differences are there. But first let me say what I mainly intend to talk about today is I'll say a few words about why I think we should, as American citizens at least, and probably as citizens of almost any country in the world, know a little bit about North Korea. And then the body of my talk is about the United States and North Korea. And I debated about how to organize the subtopics. I could have done it the other way around. But anyway, I'll give you a brief history of the U.S. relationship with North Korea. Then I'll tell you what I believe American leaders' interpretation of American interest on the Korean Peninsula and regarding North Korea have been and are. And then finally, I'll tell you what U.S. policy toward North Korea has been and what it is today. And then the third and final point is I'll just briefly mention a few ideas for working on North Korea in the classroom. And this gets back to the point I was trying to make about there being so many different interpretations of North Korea. You will see in some media and scholarly writings an emphasis on North Korea as being a victim of great powers and more recently of the United States. I can't tell you that the United States has never threatened North Korea. It has on many occasions. But I believe that so-called American threats to North Korea do not really explain very much about how North Korea behaves. In a word, I believe that North Korea is far less a victim than an agent, and that in fact, if you look at the history of the Korean Peninsula since the division of Korea, it is North Korea's leaders who've been far more aggressive toward our side, that is the United States and South Korea, than the other way around. And I believe that the reason for that is rooted in the history that Professor Lee briefed us on this morning, that because of the nature of the system that North Korea inherited and the way that system developed over the decades, the North Korean leaders are not stupid. They know that their government, their country, is far, far behind South Korea in almost all aspects, politically, economically, diplomatically, culturally, technologically. And their greatest fear is that their own people will fully realize the fact of that great difference. And because I'm sure that they have concluded that if and when the North Korean people discover that difference and fully realize its significance, that they will lose, in that instant almost, the support of their people. And that goes a very long way to explaining why the leadership of North Korea is so determined to maintain its system of isolation of the North Korean people, their complete indoctrination, and to make sure that people pay attention, the use of intimidation, force, concentration camps, when people don't. Now, but that's my interpretation. That's my belief. You'll see a lot of, in effect, direct or indirect criticism of that belief. And my argument is that stems primarily from these reasons. First, naturally enough, the North Korean regime has a very strong interest in portraying itself both to its own people and to the international community as being a victim of foreign powers, especially the United States and its so-called puppet South Korea. Natural enough, if I were in a North Korean leadership position, I would be supporting the use of my propaganda apparatus to do just that. Related to that, as I mentioned, is North Korea is a very, very secretive regime. As far as I know, the U.S. government has not a single spy in the upper reaches of the North Korean government if it has a single spy in the entire country that it's running. I doubt it. The North Koreans maintain that secrecy because they regard that as necessary for their security if they believe, I believe, that if the Americans or others know a lot about them, they'll know their weaknesses, they'll be able to exploit those. Third, as we all know, especially from the Cold War, when the United States' main adversary was the Soviet Union, there was a sort of a left-wing critical perspective on U.S. foreign policy. And I'm not here today to debate that. I share many of the left-wing criticisms of American foreign policy, or at least some elements of them. But that has not entirely disappeared in the world today. And as you know, many people in many countries can be quite critical of U.S. foreign policy in the Cold War and today. Finally, I would mention political polarization in South Korea. You'll not be surprised to learn that South Korean politics is at least divided as our own, and that has been the case well, forever. And the historical roots include many of those discussed by Professor Lee this morning. So you have, for want of a better word, the so-called South Korean conservatives who tend to view the North Korea problem more as I've just given my own views, that the problem at root is the nature of the North Korean political system. And then you have on the left, or as they call it in South Korea, progressives, who tend to ascribe more importance to the division of the peninsula as a fact and the political competition during the Cold War between the East and West, or the Communist bloc and the so-called free world, and now between a North Korea that just wants to survive but feels profoundly threatened by the United States and its South Korea ally. So I just wanted to put that out in advance because many of you already know a lot about the Korean Peninsula, but the more you read about it, the more you'll see that these fundamental differences in worldviews make a huge difference in what you read in terms of commentary and scholarship. So, the first point on my outline, why we need to know about North Korea. So the first thing is there remains a possibility of another terrible war on the Korean Peninsula. Professor Lee explained just how terrible the Korean War was. We still have 28,000 American uniformed military personnel in South Korea. And if a war breaks out there, we could again see millions of casualties on both sides. We could again possibly see China involved in a direct military confrontation with the United States, and there would again be the risk of nuclear weapons, this time with a North Korea that has some nuclear devices. Another reason we need to know about Korea is because the ordinary people of North Korea have suffered terribly because of their government. They've endured famine, not only in the 90s, but even in the 1950s, I'm being told by my historian friends who are researching this. They have no freedom of speech, and many thousands, some say up to 200,000 or 150,000, are incarcerated in horrible conditions in concentration camps. The government of North Korea to this day prevents divided family members from North and South Korea from even exchanging letters. This in the 21st century, it's unimaginably cruel. Why would they be this cruel? Again, I believe it's because the leaders of North Korea are deeply afraid of their own people gradually fully realizing the differences between North and South Korea. Third, North and South Korea constitute what social scientists call a natural experiment. Until just 7 decades ago, the people of North and South Korea had basically shared the same history for at least 1,000 years and basically the same political entity. Today, there is this enormous gap between the two countries. I think the situation on the Korean Peninsula today illustrates more vividly than probably anywhere else in the world, maybe than any time in history, what a difference governance, systems of government, and leadership makes. So now let's turn to the main part of my presentation, the relationship between the U.S. and North Korea. Again, I'll try to skip over some of the things that Professor Lee has covered. This is my own periodization of U.S.-North Korean relations. Now, of course, there was no North Korea until 1945 or 1948. But if you look back from the first American contacts with North Korea, or with Korea in the middle of the 1800s, up until the end of World War II, the United States had, as a government and as a people, had almost no interest in Korea. And there were many reasons for that. Well, in terms of security policy, it's really, really important to remember that the United States the United States of the mid-1800s or even the early 1900s was not the United States of today. We tend to forget and go back and ascribe a policy and a role for the United States in world affairs that simply didn't exist. So 125 years ago, the United States of that age was Great Britain. And the United States foreign policy was basically commercial. In the Pacific, the United States wanted an open door policy, so it had a free trading environment. And it really, for the most part, wanted to stay out of so-called entangling alliances. The Philippines, I would argue, was a premature jump into the future by Teddy Roosevelt, based largely on his personality. And that was not something that role that the United States and the American public really were prepared to do until after World War II and the Cold War. So when Japan was fighting China and Russia for control of the Korean Peninsula, the U.S., again, was not the United States of today, and it basically had a hands-off policy. And it was in 1945, basically simply to prevent the Soviets from taking over the entire peninsula, that the United States made this sudden proposal to the Soviet Union to temporarily divide the peninsula. But even then, the United States was not really interested in Korea. It was interested in China, it was interested in Japan. So the United States withdrew its military, with the exception of 500 military advisors in 1949. And the really critical thing in terms of how the United States' relationship with both North and South Korea today was the Korean War. It changed everything. And by the way, it changed not only the U.S. relationship with the Korean Peninsula, it changed how the United States dealt with the rest of the world. The Cold War had already been rising, but this was proof of Soviet perfidy, that there was a communist bloc. And if you look at the history of American security and foreign policy, you'll see that this really, really was important. It also changed the American people's perception very radically in favor of anti-Soviet policy. But in terms of Korea, the American leadership saw the invasion of South Korea not as it was in large part, an expression of Kim Il-sung's Korean nationalism, but as a Soviet-dominated, Soviet-led attempt to take over yet another country. The fact that the United States lost over 33,000 soldiers and Marines in the Korean War made it, from that point on, politically, in American domestic political terms, almost a vital interest of the United States, or at least as interpreted by our leaders, not to lose Korea, not to allow another invasion of South Korea, right? You lose that many people in a war, the last thing as a president that you want to see is that country later being taken over, right? We still have troops around in Iraq and Afghanistan, right? Same reason. But this was more powerful because this was in the middle of the Cold War. People were really afraid of the Soviet Union. People are afraid of terrorists, but they're not as afraid as they were of the Soviet Union. To this day, the United States has a profound domestic political commitment to South Korea. Many, probably most South Koreans, think that the United States is in South Korea for its own national security interest. That is an illusion, in my opinion. The United States is in South Korea for, first, for this profound political reason, and second, inertia, bureaucratic inertia. We've been doing this for so long, it's very hard to change things once you've got so many interests involved and you've been doing it so long. So since 1953 to the end of the Cold War, I would say that the overwhelming American interest on the Korean Peninsula was simply protecting South Korea from another, deterring North Korea from another invasion, and otherwise trying to protect South Korea by helping it with its economic and commercial and other development. At the end of the Cold War, a whole bunch of things came together at once. You'll recall some of these. I mean, 1987, South Korea announced democratic reforms. That was the sort of the year that we marked democratization in South Korea. That was tremendously important for the people of South Korea, but also for the United States, because up until then, South Korea, we'd been ambivalent as Americans about South Korea. We didn't, as Professor Lee mentioned, we didn't really win the war. That really was a thorn in the side of the American people and American leaders, a huge embarrassment. It was a very unpopular war. South Korea in the 1950s was regarded as an economic basket case. Okay, the 1960s and 70s, South Korean authoritarian government was really focused on economic development, and we had the so-called miracle on the Han River with, as the economy grew by about 10% each year. That was great in American eyes. At least South Korea was becoming an economic success story, and furthermore, by developing its economy, South Korea was then able to provide for itself. The United States had been providing a great deal of humanitarian assistance to South Korea, and had also been supplying probably the bulk of South Korean military arms so that they could defend themselves to some extent from North Korea and deter the country. But, and I remember this well because I was a junior officer in the Office of Korean Affairs at the State Department in the mid-1980s, U.S. was bitterly criticized by lots of South Koreans, by many Americans, and by people all over the world because at that point South Korea was still run by military-backed governments. Chun Doo-hwan was a general who took power in a coup d'etat in 1979 and 1980. People were tortured. Hundreds, if not a couple of thousand people were in jail because of their political beliefs. And Americans and South Koreans blamed the United States. Well, you have military people there. The U.S. is so powerful. If there's a problem like that, it's at least partly the United States' fault. So the U.S. government was embarrassed by this and spent a great deal of time working on it and trying to tell people that it was not the cause of this problem and was not happy with it. So when in 1987, 1988, Korea democratized, wow, this is the trifecta. We have military security, we have economic development, and now democracy. So Korea, because of these developments, went from being something that Americans were not interested in, an embarrassment, a burden, to being one of the greatest success stories for American foreign policy. And I bet many of you remember after 9/11 when the U.S. was invading Iraq or preparing to. And how many of you remember Condoleezza Rice, and I don't know, did Dick Cheney do it, would go on television and say why they were going to be tough on Iraq? One of the things they said was, just look at Korea. Because of us, Korea is this great success story, right? That was now most Koreans did not like that. They did not want to be compared with Iraq, but a lot of American leaders at that time did. And that brings us up to the end of the Cold War. So the U.S. is in pretty good shape in South Korea, but we still have this North Korea problem. So many things were changing, and seemingly in such a good direction, that American leaders were looking at the remaining problems and wanted to be proactive in dealing with them. Now, coincidentally with all of this, this was about the time that I don't know to what extent it was the American government's just becoming seriously aware of it, or that the North Koreans had just reached a certain stage, but the administration of George Herbert Walker Bush was becoming disturbed about the North Korean nuclear project. They had had help from the Russians to put in some small nuclear test reactors and things like that, but around the late 1980s, the U.S. government intelligence community and political leaders were becoming concerned about where this was all leading. So with the end of the Cold War, there was fresh thinking, and one of the things that was done was President George Herbert Walker Bush announced the withdrawal of American tactical, well, actually, we withdrew tactical nuclear weapons from all over the world, virtually, I think, including the Korean Peninsula, and tacitly, I guess, agreed that the South Korean president could also announce that those tactical nuclear weapons had been withdrawn from South Korea. About the same time, the president of South Korea was also very active in establishing relations with the Soviet Union and China, and trying to establish talks with the North Koreans. Those occurred, and there was actually a very important agreement reached between the two sides on a basic agreement on relationships between North and South Korea, and a subsequent agreement on promising each other not to develop nuclear weapons capacity. Unfortunately, this quickly fell apart. But the U.S. was so concerned that we began our first sustained negotiations with North Korea in 1993 and 1994, focused on trying to freeze and end North Korea's nuclear weapons capacity. That resulted in the 1994 so-called Agreed Framework. And basically, we promised to develop 2 peaceful nuclear power plants for the North Koreans, and to provide them fuel oil in the meantime, and to ease sanctions, and to establish embassies in the 2 countries. That was the big deal. That was between President Clinton's administration and when Kim Il-sung was still in office, and then just after he died. This was a big deal, and it was the U.S. effort to try to resolve one of the last remaining Cold War problems. It was very difficult. It was difficult because it was unprecedented to have the U.S. government build nuclear power plants as a government in a place like North Korea, which was politically extremely authoritarian and opaque, and economically very primitive. The North Koreans were very suspicious. It took years and years just to reach the basic detailed agreements on who's going to get visas to go into the country to do the construction, and so on and so forth. Meanwhile, the Republicans under Newt Gingrich in 1994 won control of Congress, and they were very opposed to this kind of a deal with North Korea, sort of similar to the Iran deal today. But it continued. We continued on both sides, more or less, to implement it through the end of the Clinton administration. Let me skip through some of these and catch up here. So again, this was the 1991-92 North-South Korean agreement. These are the 2 prime ministers getting together. These were the American and North Korean negotiators for the agreed framework. The North Korean negotiator just died a couple of months ago of old age. I didn't mention that during this period, during the middle of the Clinton administration, there was this terrible famine we discussed this morning. And at the very end of the Clinton administration, how many remember when Madeleine Albright visited Pyongyang? Yeah, it was quite a deal. One of the things she was bitterly criticized about, including in the Washington Post editorial pages, was going to the mass games that Kim Il-sung or Kim Jong-il invited her to while she was there, and they had all of these mass games, and some of the scenes were of North Korean missiles being launched into the air, which was the main reason for her visit. Was not the nuclear issue. It was because in 1998, the North Koreans had launched their first long-range rocket, and it launched it over Sapporo, as I recall. Nobody said, where did that? Everybody said, where did that come from? So that caused tremendous concern in the United States and, of course, Japan.
What was she supposed to do? She was there. This was planned
Well,
for months. It was like ridiculous.
That was her argument. And the argument of her critics was, you should have said no. Because he asked her, typical of the North Koreans, and I've seen it myself, I've been there 5 times on short visits, but if you go to North Korea, unless you're going on a regular tourist agency organized visit, and perhaps even then, the North Koreans will not tell you who you're going to be able to meet. They won't agree on an agenda with you very much and anything like that. So Kim Jong-il, as I recall, the same day or something like that, said, oh, by the way, come on and see the Arirang Mass Games this evening, Madam Secretary. And as you said, or suggested, her response was, well, I can't, he's the host, I can't really say no. And of course, to be fair, she had no idea that they were going to be shooting, figurative missiles up into the air. President Clinton, the whole idea behind this visit was that this was, October, I believe, of 2000, just at the end of the Clinton administration. And the whole idea was she would go and do the preliminary sounding out of the North Koreans to see if we could get a deal about, especially limiting their missile program. And then if that looked good, then President Clinton would visit before the end of his term and then sign an agreement or formalize whatever understandings they were able to reach. Well, there just wasn't enough time. And I'll tell you an anecdote, so this is not too dry. So was it 2009 that President Clinton went to North Korea to pick up these 2 American journalists who were incarcerated there, and I got to go along with him, and he told me in the airplane, basically we were on some rich guy's 737, sort of like Donald Trump's private 737, and he had only his 6 or 7 staff members with him, and they'd all been with him for, I guess, years, if not decades, and so every time he started to tell one of his stories, they all sort of backed away because they'd heard that story. So I didn't know him, but for me it was new. It was kind of interesting. It also would have been rude for me to be the last person backing away. So he said, yeah. He said, I really wanted to go to North Korea at the end of 2000. But he said, there was just so little time. By the time the North Koreans took up our offer of negotiations, there was just only a few months before I stepped down. And he said, I had a choice, basically, in terms of the time left, of working on the Palestinian problem or going to North Korea. And he said, I met with Yasser Arafat. And he begged me to devote that remaining time to the Palestinian problem. And he said, he cried. And he said, I knew Arafat. I shouldn't have believed him. You never could believe Arafat, but he cried. So I said, okay, I would work on that. And we ran out of time. And he said, sure enough, Arafat didn't keep his end of the bargain. So that brings us to the George W. Bush administration. And I would argue that U.S. policy toward North Korea has been largely very consistent between the George Herbert Walker Bush administration, that is the post-Cold War period policy, all the way up until the present day. Now, circumstances have changed. Policies have been adapted or adjusted to the changed circumstances, but in terms of the interpretation of American interest and the basic policy and goals pursued, they're basically the same. The exception to a significant but not total degree is the George W. Bush administration's first term in office. President Bush and his top people came to office in 2001 extremely skeptical of the agreed framework between the United States and North Korea in building these two nuclear power plants in North Korea. I think basically they felt that you couldn't trust the North Koreans, and moreover, people like President Cheney, I believe, felt it was beneath the dignity of the United States to deal as an equal or as an equal sovereign with a country and a leader like North Korean Kim Jong-il. Anyway, the tone of the U.S. policy changed significantly, and the U.S. was much less prepared to sit down with the North Koreans and negotiate. Now, but the Bush administration was preparing to resume comprehensive negotiations with the North Koreans in the summer of 2002. But that's just about the time that the U.S. intelligence community got information that they understood to mean that the North Koreans were going full steam ahead with a secret program to help them produce nuclear weapons. Now, up until now, the North Koreans had been using plutonium at a known facility in North Korea as the basis for their nuclear program. That's two ways to make nuclear weapons. One is plutonium, the other is you enrich uranium. And this second one was enriching uranium. They got more aluminum, special kind of aluminum to make the centrifuges to enrich uranium and things like that. So I was part of the small American delegation that went to North Korea in October of 2002. The North Koreans thought we were coming to resume comprehensive negotiations, George W. Bush style. Instead, our instructions had changed in the meantime, and we basically told the North Koreans, look, we thought we were going to have comprehensive negotiations too, but we discovered you're basically cheating on the spirit of the agreed framework by having this new secret nuclear program, and that we're not going to have other negotiations with you until you walk that back, until you end that program. Well, the North Korean reaction was they didn't deny it, and I think in my colleagues' interpretation, made it clear that they were in effect acknowledging that they had such a program, because they said, but they did not deny it, and then they said, well, we're willing to negotiate about that if you'll first give us a peace treaty. I've forgotten the exact. There were three things they said. One was, don't interfere with our economic relations with other countries. In other words, remove sanctions. And it was something like a peace treaty and something else. They said, you do that first, and then we'll negotiate about what's of interest to you. Well, that was, since the only thing we talked about was the uranium enrichment program, we regarded that as an acknowledgement of that. Now, at first the North Koreans, we came back home, the news leaked a few weeks later, and at first the North Koreans didn't say anything, and then when they saw that the so-called admission or acknowledgement was getting them in trouble, then they started publicly denying that they'd ever said anything like that. I think that the North Koreans misunderstood American politics. The very last thing the North Koreans told us at that meeting was, and maybe, after they said, well, you do this first and then we'll negotiate about this other thing. They said, and maybe we can get Kim Jong-il together with George W. Bush, like President Clinton was preparing to do. Now, George W. Bush had already publicly, I think, had he already publicly called Kim Jong-il a pygmy or something horrible like that? There was no way George W. Bush was going to be meeting with Kim Jong-il. But I think the North Koreans, not knowing much about the United States except their dealings with President Clinton and his administration, thought, well, they're all Americans, presumably, Bush is sort of like Clinton, and we can do the same thing. And I think what they were saying at the end of that meeting was, yeah, let's renegotiate the agreed framework. You give us more, and then we may say we will give you more. right? Anyway, that's my interpretation of what happened. Everything blew up. The Bush administration was very divided at the top levels. There had been little to no thinking about how we would react, how the North Koreans would react to this ultimatum, in effect, and little to no thinking about how we would respond to the North Korean response. So we had no policy when the North Koreans said they were withdrawing from the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, the first and only country to ever do that. We had no policy when the North Koreans kicked out the international inspectors from the International Atomic Energy Agency. We had no response when the North Koreans said, okay, we're restarting all these nuclear facilities. So there was a great deal of churning, and eventually the Bush administration said, okay, well, let's support multilateral talks, including China. These soon became the six-party talks that you've all heard about. Let's see, there. Okay, I was in the first 3 rounds of that. I think President Bush's idea, as best I can tell, was twofold. One, I really don't want to negotiate bilaterally with the North Koreans because they say one thing to us and they say another thing to the South Koreans and another thing to the Chinese. Second, if we can get the Chinese in the room, the Chinese have all this potential leverage over the North Koreans. When the Chinese hear what the North Koreans are saying, the Chinese will use their leverage to help us get them to denuclearize. And moreover, we want to make sure that our allies, South Korea and Japan, are in. Somebody, I think it was the North Koreans, said, what about the Russians? So he said, at that time our relationship with Russia was good, so he said, fine, okay, no problem. So that's the six-party talks. In my opinion, it was I understand the reasons, I've just explained them to you. And I think it was a failure of concept, misunderstanding of China's interest and foreign policy instincts. I don't even, contrary to most probably people or many people who follow the Korean Peninsula closely, I don't even believe that the 2 agreements we reached in 2005 and 2007 were serious. And I think that's demonstrated by the fact that the talks fell apart in 2008 because the North Koreans refused to agree to serious verification of the denuclearization steps that had been tentatively agreed upon. So we haven't had any talks on a denuclearization in the six-party talks since 2008. I'll get back to Obama in a second if I don't, remind me. So, American interest. So again, I said that since 1950, basically, the United States' primary interest on the Korean Peninsula has been to protect South Korea. The second, and this is very important, is to avoid war. The Korean War was not popular. We did not win it. And to this day, what would be one of the worst things that could happen to the United States would be another war on the Korean Peninsula. Why? Because South Korea is our great success story. If there's another war on the Korean Peninsula, at best, it could very well be only a Pyrrhic victory. There could be tremendous damage to our ally, South Korea. So watch what happens when the North Koreans attack South Korea, like in 2010 when they sneak attacked and blew up a ship, killed 46 young men in their hammocks, or when they used artillery for the first time since the Korean War against civilians, a civilian island, and killed 4 people in 2010. What did the United States do? Did it launch an attack against North Korea? Did it support South Korea in launching a retaliatory attack to teach those North Koreans a lesson? No. We said, hold off. We don't know. We could make things worse. Don't attack. Let's think this through. That is, if you go back and look at the history since 1953, that is almost always the American reaction to trouble on the Korean Peninsula. Some South Koreans appreciate that. Many get very frustrated at it. And just imagine how Americans would react if they were in a similar situation.
Didn't the U.S. add more troops to that area? So that would be
We have not added more troops. You can see, if you Google, you'll see since 1953, we keep reducing, in steps the number of troops. So in the early 2000s, we went from, what was it, 35,000 or something to now it's about 28,000. But we have we do add new weapons and more advanced technology. We send these advanced bombers to Guam and sometimes around South Korea as a show of force. And a lot of people mistake that and say, oh, the United States is being warlike. I mean, well, I don't know what the people in the military who suggest doing this are thinking for sure. I think they probably think this is a show of strength that will deter North Korea. But I think most of that happens out of inertia, because that's what the military does. But if you look at what the political leadership who make the ultimate decisions on war and peace on the Korean Peninsula, their reaction is, step back, let's make sure we don't accidentally cause a war on the Korean Peninsula. So if it took a war to protect South Korea, for example, if North Korea invaded the South again, no doubt in my mind whatsoever, we Americans would be fighting a major war on the Korean Peninsula again. But unless it's a circumstance like that, the U.S. instinct is to avoid anything that might, or almost things that might even minimally increase the risk of war. Third, since the end of the Cold War, I would say in priority order, U.S. policy and focus has been on how do we keep North Korea from getting nuclear weapons, and now how do we roll back that program. And fourth, help the North Korean people. In the mid-1990s, during the famine, too late, we provided a tremendous amount of humanitarian food aid and other supplies to North Korea. U.S. officials and the American people have long been concerned about the human rights situation in North Korea, but we haven't really focused on it that much until recently. Up until the end of the Cold War, our focus as a country was not on the Korean Peninsula, especially not on North Korea, and especially not on the North Korean human rights situation. It was seen as part of this communist bloc. We had far bigger fish to fry with North Korea and China and so forth. But after the end of the Cold War, North Korea stuck out like a sore thumb. You know, it's one of 5 remaining communist states. It's got this extremely anachronistic system and so forth. And with the advent of the internet especially, we're now able to get more and more information about North Korea. When I was working on North Korea 20 years ago, I had so little information. Every one of you can go on Google and get 1,000 times more information about North Korea today as a private citizen than I could 15 years ago or 20 years ago as a U.S. government official working on the problem. So this is helping the international and the U.S. focus on the human rights situation to increase. Now, another thing, that as long as the U.S. government felt there was a chance that we could reach a diplomatic deal with North Korea, not to nuclearize or now to give up nuclear weapons, the U.S. pushed back American officials and American public opinion saying, we should focus more on the we should focus more on the human rights problem, right? The U.S. government didn't say it this way because it would be not very politic to do so, but the reason was, if we go after the North Korean regime in a big way on the human rights issue, there's no chance we're going to be able to get an agreement with North Korea on the nuclear issue. So we held off. This year, you may have seen the headlines. Congress passed legislation, and based on that, the Obama administration very recently specifically designated Kim Jong-un personally as responsible, along with his top people, responsible for the human rights situation in his country. That sets the stage under certain circumstances, which are not here yet, for Kim Jong-un being put on trial by an international tribunal and I don't know, being put in prison for life or who knows. This is a tremendous step. Now, at this point, and maybe forever, it's only symbolic, but it's a huge step. But regarding the nuclear issue, again, I'm pretty sure the Obama administration would not have agreed to this, would not have done it, if they thought that there was a reasonable hope of reaching a reasonable, verifiable, sustainable denuclearization agreement with North Korea. So that shows us we're in a different stage than we've been since the end of the Cold War with North Korea on the nuclear problem. Everything is, contrary to what you'll see in a lot of the media, everything is not the same. This year marks a very different stage. Let's see, that's that. So basically, that is our policy. Our interests, our policy reflects the interest as they're seen by these U.S. presidents and the top people around them. Finally, and I've spoken longer than I intended, in the classroom, you all have already discussed some of this, and since, as I said, I've been wonderfully pleased by how knowledgeable you all are, I'm not sure this will help you that much. But let me just say a word about it. I think the North Korea problem is a very big problem historically, and it could be an even bigger problem in the future. So it holds great potential consequences, not only for the North Koreans north and south, but for the international community as a whole, and especially for us in the United States. So it's well worth teaching. And moreover, there are many aspects of the North Korea problem that illuminate important things that all students should know. For younger students, I think that the so-called natural experiment aspect may be the most teachable. By exploring the differences in history and systems and leadership, they'll be able to see the differences in governance and outcome of governments that are most notably indicated by that satellite photograph of the Korean Peninsula at night. Of course, older students too can benefit by focusing on this. For somewhat older students, the Korean War is a very important episode in the history of the United States, and in particular of how our country came to play the role in international affairs that it plays to this very day. And for high school students in particular, the North Korea problem is a terrific topic to explore current affairs and to do basic foreign policy and international relations analysis. The subject is important. It's complex, and as I discussed at the outset, the views about about the problem, how to deal with it, differ enough that it will challenge students to come up with their own assessments. And students can profitably research, I think especially the nuclear issue and the human rights issue in this regard. Older students might enjoy role-playing. While I was at Stanford for a number of years, I helped team teach a class on U.S. policy toward Northeast Asia, and we had a six-party role-playing exercise. The Korea Economic Institute down in Washington, D.C. arranged and implemented these, but I think it's quite possible for creative folks like you to do something similar. Basically, we divided our students up into, your Russian representative, your Chinese representative, and you would give everybody sort of a basic outline of what this is all about. And then you would give each country representative, each diplomat, a sheet of paper that said, your goals are. And of course, they didn't share that with the other team. And then you put the six around a table and let them negotiate it. And it was quite fun. Since I had been in the actual negotiations, I had a sense of how they went. And within a few minutes, the students were quite passionately advocating the North Korean position or the Russian position. It's fun. It's fun. So that's basically the main points I wanted to pass on. Again, if you have a chance, this is a little disjointed, and you'll be able to glance at the full prepared text and the earlier speech I gave at Stanford if you'd like to see more. So I'll stop there. We have how many minutes of discussion?
We have
20 minutes, so plenty of time for questions. Feel free to ask me anything about what we've been talking about. U.S. policy toward North Korea, U.S. relations with North and South Korea, my experiences in South Korea as a foreigner. I first went there in '79 to '84, again '99 to 2002. I finally wrote a little book about anti-Americanism in South Korea. It was based upon my experiences when I was at the embassy the last time, 1999 to 2002, when I think, in hindsight, Koreans basically let off steam that had been building up for 4 or 5 decades, but it was pretty hot steam. And there was a lot of ugly things said and done in regard to the United States. So, whatever you like. Please, go ahead.
I was just reading the book Nothing to Envy on
Yes.
on
Barbara Demick's
yes,
book.
North Koreans who escaped to South Korea. And there was one story that kind of related to what you were talking about. One young man was like a university student. He had got a TV, and he rigged it up so that he could get South Korean news. And he had a had a jury in the back.
Yeah.
And he said that Kim Il-sung hired, he was the first time he ever heard his real voice.
Yeah.
Because he had hired voice actors to be the
Sung
president.
or Kim Jong-il? Kim Il-sung?
Kim,
Or Kim Jong-il?
the second one.
Yeah.
Kim Jong-il, yeah,
Kim
right,
Jong-il
right.
hired
Right.
voice actors, and so he never really heard his real voice. And I just kind of thought, like if President Obama hired Morgan Freeman to be like his voice actor, whenever he was on TV.
Yeah.
And he said as soon as he heard his real voice, he said that's when he decided to leave. Because he said this guy's not a god, he's just a dude.
How do you get out?
And well, I haven't gotten to that part yet in the book.
Okay, well,
So, yeah, it's Barbara Demick, former Los Angeles Times correspondent in Korea. It's a terrific book, several chapters about individual North Koreans who defected or were refugees from North Korea. I didn't remember that particular one. My favorite one is about the two young lovers. First love for the girl, and did you? Yeah, it is one of the most wonderful. I mean, if you just took it as fiction, it would be a wonderful short story, and it's just beautifully written, and it sounds so real, and so I have no reason to doubt that hardly anything of it is not just the way it was written. And it could easily be turned into a short movie or some indie movie. If you are interested in fiction or the Korean Peninsula or current affairs, I would recommend you at least read that chapter. It is wonderful. I will not tell you the terrific ending. Well, terrific may not be the right word. Sad in a way, real, true to life. But anyway, that's great. Kim Jong-il's voice. Yeah, for a long time, we in the U.S. government had the only recording we had of Kim Jong-il when he once said "manse" or "hurrah" to something at a speech. And so there was all kinds of speculation that the guy could not speak properly or something like that. As for voiceover, I guess probably what he was talking about was whenever they did reports on what he was saying, somebody else would just say what he was saying or something like that. I'm not sure. But your mention of it reminded me that we did not have any record of his speaking. And there is, probably many of you have heard that Kim Jong-il, he was this great movie buff. He allegedly had a library of 10,000 Western and other movies. He had kidnapped South Korea's most famous movie director and his ex-wife, one of the most famous actresses in the country. And in 1983, I guess it was, one of the movie director's elementary school friend's daughters, who was living in the United States, called me and visited me at the Korea desk at the State Department. She came and we sat there across my little table, and she started telling me that her father was an elementary school friend of what's his name, Shin Sang-ok, and that Shin really, really was abducted. He wasn't a defector, and he wanted to escape, and he needed American help. And I knew a little bit about this from the media, but who is this person, and is this credible? So I continued to ask her questions, and at one point she mentioned, we have, something about having tape recordings of Shin and his wife, Miss Che, talking with Kim Jong-il. And I said, what? Remember, we'd only heard the word "manse" coming from his mouth. And she said, yeah. I said, you have tape recordings? She said, yeah. She said, I said, how did you get tape recordings? She said, well, Miss Che would carry a microcassette. Remember those little microcassette recorders in her handbag when she went to see Kim Jong-il? And I said, how could I get some? She said, oh, we have copies. I said, can you bring them? So she said, yes. And I don't remember, a few days later, she came back from New Jersey and handed me a plastic bag with, I don't know, 20 of these little microcassettes. so I'm astounded first, that could be true. So I took these home that evening because I didn't have a micro cassette player there, and my wife, who was from Korea, and I said, these might be Kim Jong-il's voice. So we were sitting in our bed, and this was a big secret, so we covered our heads with a blanket, and we tried to listen to these. And it sounded like they had been recorded from inside a purse. And so I took these back to the next morning, and I got on I guess it was still a typewriter, and no, we had Wang computers, word processors. So I typed 1.5 pages saying, this lady came down, and here's what she said, and here are supposed to be recordings of Kim Jong-il. And my director, a wonderful lady, said, really, David? I said, well, I don't know for sure that it's true, but it's plausible enough. We really need to send this, over there or upstairs or something. So finally she signed it. I never heard anything more. And then I can't remember if it was months or a year later, I think I was listening to the radio. Breaking news, famous South Korean director and actress wife escape into the American embassy in Vienna. Now, I mention this in this length because on something like September 22 or 23, a docudrama about this is going to be released in the United States called The Lovers and the Despot. It's by Magnolia Pictures. It will, it's only going to be shown, I guess, in small art theaters, but it's also going to be in iTunes and places like that. And I'm in it. They have these talking heads, and I'm one of the talking heads, and I tell a little bit about. I haven't seen it, so I have no. It's been shown at film festivals, but so I may look like a complete idiot, but you've already seen me, so you know.
That particular story was told on This American Life podcast.
Oh, was it?
Yeah, This American Life did a lot of stories. They do a lot of stories.
Yeah.
About well, just people in general. There's quite a number of stories about North Korea, but they definitely did that particular story.
Yeah, because they both, when they defected initially, they came to the States.
Yeah, and they Ira Glass interviewed them. It's very interesting.
Yeah, so that I was not in the intelligence community, so they weren't telling me what they were doing.
So if you Google This American Life, North Korean stories, you will get
I'll
that.
look it up.
And they've done great stories. They've also, they spent a couple of weeks at the refugee camps in Greece. So they do some.
Yeah,
really
it's a great
good
series.
things.
Yeah. By the way, so I wasn't being told any of this stuff, but my wife and I were still working in Washington and living in Northern Virginia, and one day, for some reason, I was tagging along as my wife was shopping at Marshall's or something like that, and she said, David. I said, what? She said, look over there. That's Cheon-hee. And this Korean lady who looked about the right age and shape and everything. She had on big dark sunglasses and a scarf, but I think my wife is right, it was Cheon-hee. Anyway, they moved back to Korea. He died a few years ago. She's still alive. Anyway, a lot of books and stuff and that movie coming out now. You had...
Oh, yeah. Was it last week that a envoy from in London defected? Yes,
I think the number 2 diplomat at the North Korean embassy.
And he had been in London for 10 plus years?
Yeah, that's sort of the Soviet style. Remember when the Soviet ambassador to the U.S. was here for 10 years or more?
So I was listening to the news, and they said that this is kind of unprecedented because, one, to have somebody there for so long, but two, he just kind of waltzed away and was just like, I'm gonna fly instead of to Pyongyang, I'm gonna fly to Seoul and whatever. And then they said that usually they leave behind a significant family member, and they don't think that this was the case in this instance. So they said that there was going to be massive repercussions in North Korea. Usually they trot out a bunch of people and just kill them. But I mean, can you tell us anything more about?
Well, so yes, it seems that the number 2 person at the North Korean embassy in London did defect. His wife, at least, and possibly he, comes from an elite family that had connections to Kim Il-sung, so that made them special. Presumably, that's why he was allowed to spend so many years there. I guess they had 3 children, and all of them were in London.
Yeah, and they
Anyway.
went to like public school. They went to just like a
Yeah,
regular
yeah.
school.
So they were. So he had, I guess, all of his immediate family with him. Again, presumably because of his special status. You know, the media, especially sometimes the South Korean media, sometimes exaggerates consequences. I doubt that anybody will be executed in North Korea over this. But, and presumably has other family members there, cousins and so forth. But my guess is the North Korean, all governments keep close watch over their diplomats and their intelligence people and stuff like that. North Korea certainly so. But this was a very small embassy. And presumably that also allowed him more freedom of movement. But what I expect will happen is that Kim Jong-un already appeared to be cracking down more on his people crossing into China, and, you know, because he's nervous about this. So I would expect that he will have his security agencies implement more restrictions, more monitoring of people, including diplomats. And it's quite possible that that in turn will make people in those positions even more nervous, and possibly it could have the opposite effect. It could make people leave before they think things are going to get even worse. So it sometimes is a vicious cycle.
Will they attempt to kill this guy in South Korea?
There have been North Korean defectors who have been killed, and at least once one of Kim Jong-un's was it nephew? Kim Jong-il's nephew by marriage. So anyway, really close people. A person was apparently executed, and there have been reports of a number of other attempts by North Korean agents to kill defectors in South Korea. So typically the South Korean government provides security, at least for some years, for people who might be in danger. Yes?
So my question is more about, here's American policy and the relationship with North Korea. Or have the United States learned lessons and now kind of consult with the South Korean people themselves about what is it that you want to happen to North Korea? What is the goal? Or are we just making this policy without considering the ramification of how it impacts the people in that area, because it's like a snowball effect. You know, everyone else is involved. And how is Russia influenced now? I mean, are we being more collaborative, I guess?
Right.
Because we also hear a story about the Olympic athletes, the North Korean athletes, given Samsung phones, you know, and then they're taken away. I mean, it's all kind of other stuff going on.
Yeah. So diplomatic establishments, the American embassy all over the world, including Korea, spend quite a bit of time trying to understand how the people and the governments of each country look at things. And I know from my own personal experience that at our embassy in South Korea, as well as, you know, we have analysts in the U.S., all over the U.S. government who follow Korean affairs, they spend quite a bit of time trying to understand trends in popular opinion in South Korea, and especially issues about things like North Korea and unification. But the problem is, of course, like all countries, you know, there's no one South Korea. South Koreans, as I mentioned, are deeply divided, especially on issues such as North Korea. The other thing is, while I think in most respects the U.S. and South Korea writ large, if you think of South Korea as one, which it really isn't, no more than the U.S. is really one, U.S. and South Korean interests generally are parallel or identical, but there are some things where our interests may not be exactly the same. So first, we don't have a single South Korean opinion to which we can defer, and second, even if there were, there might be occasions when our interests would differ somewhat from that opinion. So as for cooperating with, you said the Russians. Did you mean the Russians?
How is is Russia still influencing
Yeah, Russia.
policy in North Korea? And there's word that even China is like getting frustrated with
Yeah.
North Korea.
So, North Korea was set up by Joe Stalin and his military officers and his government, as Professor Lee described. But Kim Il-sung was very much Korean, and in his own terms, I think a Korean nationalist. He probably thought of himself as a Korean patriot. I think that's one of the reasons he wanted to unify the peninsula. Probably the other was alpha male ambition at the expense of everybody else. But to be fair to him, I think part of it was nationalism. He was an officer in the Soviet army. He had worked with the Chinese, and yet if you, the more I look into it, the more he really did not like the Chinese. And was, I don't know if he disliked the Russians that much, but he wasn't, didn't feel very beholden to them. And in fact, North Korea's relations with both the Soviet Union and Russia later and with China has been very bad for very long stretches of the history of North Korea. To be brief, today, for the last decade or so, under Putin's influence, the Soviet Union, or Russia, went from being fairly sympathetic to the American view of North Korea to, I think, basically just disliking the United States so much that if they can use the Korea problem to annoy the United States, Putin would like to do that, and he's done that. China, the Chinese, not only do the North Koreans generally not like the Chinese, including Chinese leaders, really don't like the North Korean regime. They really don't. There's plenty of evidence for that. Now, that's a broad assertion. There are exceptions and so forth. But generally, the Chinese leadership are really frustrated. They feel that the North Koreans are hurting their interest, that the North Koreans are ungrateful for all that they did to save them. But on the other hand, the Chinese these days, the past 5 or 10 years, have become increasingly suspicious of the United States, even, in my opinion, a little bit paranoid, thinking that the United States, after helping them rise up for 20 years, is now trying to stifle them. And so they tend to look at the North Korea or the Korean Peninsula through the lens of their feelings about the United States. And unfortunately, the way they feel about the United States has been getting worse and worse in recent years. And as on the one hand, they're increasingly frustrated with North Koreans. On the other, they're increasingly suspicious of the U.S. So that makes it very hard for the United States to get the leverage that from China's influence over North Korea that we would really like to get. That's one of the reasons we haven't gone back to the six-party talks, I think. It's because American officials increasingly realized, there was only so much help we could get from China. How many minutes? We finished? Or you?
Are there any, there are no more questions. I think we can wrap it up.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.